to study. What is actually needed is a multiscalar approach, and looking at this phenomenon of materiality and sociality being out of synchrony with each other, and we need to analyse outcome. When I was in Denmark, every June as a visiting fellow at the UrbNet Centre in Musgard. In the Musgard Centre they've built a new and marvellous museum, and in the middle of that museum is the Staircase of Evolution, which is very carefully arranged so that Lucy is at the top of the stairs and modern humans are at the bottom of the stairs. It's really nicely done. That's Lucy. That's me. Lucy's not very big. Lucy's got fingernails, and Lucy's got stupid little small canines. She's pretty small. That's the male, and those are the hyenas of the Pleistocene. Now, if you were an outside observer, what would you put your odds on? Lucy or these bastards? But there's a catch. See in his hand? I've carefully drawn in a stone tool. If you are a nasty, smelly little biped on the open savannas of Africa, but you can chuck a rock, hyenas would be very disinclined to think you were dinner. A rock in the face thrown by a binocular vision, big swing animal is likely to damage your face really badly. Guess who's in the zoo? Guess who owns the zoo? That's an outcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. Your questions?
I'll get us started. Thanks. That's pretty depressing, which is great. It's
welcome
like,
to the world.
It's like Monday morning, but
oh, can I title my? I'll use that as my lecture. This is Monday morning.
But, yeah, no. I mean, I particularly like kind of the sense of the ramifications of materiality, or whatever we want to call it, as scale increases, this sense, and I like very much the way you said that cities themselves become a threat. But one thing that, I guess, two kind of questions I would raise is, for me, there's an oddity that you're creating a dichotomy between materiality and sociality, and then saying, well, they don't map onto each other.
Yeah.
But then your definition of materiality, although not, you're not talking about mountains and streams, there's something about materiality, as you're describing it here, is somehow the material realm that engages with humans.
Yeah.
So for my own kind of preference, I would tend to prefer not to make this kind of dichotomy.
Right.
I would agree 100% that if you make these absolutes, they don't map onto each other. And language, for example, I couldn't agree more. But that I am a little concerned about this creation of two realms, as opposed to seeing there being this something else that you do seem to be calling materiality, which is this very human engagement with material. The second comment, I guess, can't resist, although I have to say Hillary works at Lemekwe, so you're going to get something about Lemekwe. But I mean, I'll be honest, I don't buy it. That the mapping of space involved whether hominins were picking up stone tools and making inferences about them the way that we do, in a sense. Possible, there's no way to test that I can think of. But complex spatial mapping is a primate thing generally, and compared to knowing when, gorillas know when everything's gonna fruit within a large space. I don't see that as a, the increase. If it would take an increase that I'm saying, oh, there are people here because, oh, look at these stone tools. Oh, there was like, the Turkana school people were here, or something. I don't see that as being any more demanding than knowing, on April 12th, that tree over there is going to have fruit on it, which is something gorillas do, for so complex three-dimensional spatial maps. So that particular argument, I'm very, very hesitant to buy in, as opposed to the other kind of ingrained physical, cognitive, material, not entanglement, I agree with you there as well, but kind of meshing together. So those are two somewhat unrelated comments, but the scope is very impressive, and the kind of thinking, I think people like me who do Paleolithic stuff, it's very hard for us to think about the complex modern world, and I really like that you push us in that direction.
If I can come back to talking about Lamecra later, I think there's a fair comment. This materiality, sociality works as a distinction. If we were not to make that distinction, we would get into complexity terminology. And my experience is that complexity terminology completely flummoxes almost any audience you want to talk to. The point I would make is that in all this analysis, this is all stuff humans make. It isn't that this stuff is autonomous. We make it. The problem with it is that it has inertia. After we have made it, it sticks around. The great quality of a guerrilla camp is that within less than 3 months you can't see it, because it's all organic. All they've done is pulled grass and stuff together, and it's vanished. It's rotted away, been or whatever. The big difference with us is that we are permanently engaged with durable stuff. So the reason why I would make the materiality distinction is that there is this durability beyond the intention of the act. We want something, we make something. I don't have any doubt of that.
But then you have the difficulty. Now, and I've walked many of these same paths, so this isn't a criticism. Then you remove wooden artifacts. So then the northwest coast of Canada becomes an anomaly. That nothing. Gary Copeland comes back from a season of excavation with 2 little bags of lithics and says, "Here's my stuff." Until he finds 10 million beads, I guess. But so there's, you inevitably, my experience has been inevitably when you try to do this, you end up confounding yourself. That when you try to say, oh, this is what makes it distinctive, you end up saying, oh wait, but here's a counter example. So I do have difficulty with that kind of effort of saying, okay, it's a durable thing, whereas animals don't do durable things. Well, yeah, but there's lots that we do that's not durable. So that would be a kind of a. But I don't want to. Yeah, no.
But I think there's actually an interesting follow-on on a test phenomenon. What I remember a remark in New Zealand about the only damn thing in New Zealand is stone tools. There's no pottery. Every occupation site is just a scatter of obsidian in these big structures. It would lead to an interesting implication that you could do some rigorous testing within the archaeological record. For instance, there is this very popular notion that there is a whole bamboo wood tradition in the Paleolithic in Southeast Asia. Now, clearly there are wet sites where we could actually ascertain that. In principle, if one is arguing that durability is a consequential phenomenon, we then have a crucial test, is to go and look at cultures where you would not be able to see readily that people were in place, and cultures where you could see. The interesting question, obviously, with the Northwest Coast Indians is that they build pretty big stuff. You can see where a Northwest Coast Indian village is centuries after it's been abandoned, and given that they can produce minerals 6 meters deep, that materiality is there. So I think there may be an interesting follow-on that there's another way round, is to ask the question and get into the Paleolithic particularly, do we have populations which are using more organic tools and less stone, and what do they look like, and what's the end product? That would be, it's never occurred to me before, that would be a really interesting test, because we have some very strange blanks in the Paleolithic of Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia. I never thought that's a really interesting issue to pursue. So rather than it being a problem, it may actually be a test base. Now should we go on to Rebecca? He's dropped you right in.
Yeah, no, he outed me. Yeah, well, so yeah, I work in Western Ghana. I work on the early Chilean actually, but I've also looked at Lemekli.
You are very lucky.
I'm very lucky.
Wow.
But yeah, so it's interesting to think. I've never heard. First of all, thank you for talking about Lemekli. I've never heard of really someone putting that in a talk to talk about like the materiality of hominins, let alone that the artifacts are real and all that kind of thing. So that's nice. What's interesting to me is like thinking about body size, like you've just brought up at the end, and the Lemekli tools being so enormous in proportion to body size. Like these are not, the majority of Lemekli things that we've found are not mobile.
You don't carry them around.
No.
I didn't know.
Yeah, so they're these huge, they're mostly big anvils or massive, maybe they're cores. Of course we found flakes, but they're there next to the core, so it's very unclear. You know, clearly there's percussive activities happening there. Nick is working on figuring out exactly what those things are. But to me, and what strikes me as well, is that the raw material sources that we think they were extracting these cobbles from are, you know, within tens of meters of the site. So you've got a place on the landscape that's attracted these hominins. So, but then they've created cultural signatures that would be identifiable, I suppose, on the landscape. But also, of course, the issue of palimpsest and just, I mean, how many generations go between, you know, is this a multi-use site, is it not? So I think these questions are really important when we think about exactly when hominins are sort of imposing this materiality signature on the landscape versus how raw materials are drawing them to these places in the landscape, and particularly, you know, when we get to the early Achillean, sort of just up the road in Turkana. Of course, by that point you have all sorts of Oldowan scatters and all sorts of things, you know, all over the landscape. But again, the sources are quite close. You have the production of these sort of larger tools, but then also smaller things. So what I think about a lot is the origin of when hominins are able to impose shape, or are able to actually create things of shape.
Right. Do you mean with the symmetries?
Sure, yeah. And what I've seen through studying these sites is that rather than the imposition of shape, it's sort of a reflection on what's available in the landscape, so that, you know, you're using bigger, more elongated things to make big elongated things, but you're not taking a big round thing and making it elongated. So again, it's I like to think about the evolution of cognition as being completely reflective of the material engagement.
Sure.
And so, I don't know, but I haven't thought too much about this sort of on a landscape scale. I suppose. And so this is very interesting.
To come back on that, there are two really extreme extensions of this argument, which is going to create an awful problem for you guys as archaeologists in the Paleolithic. There should be, before recognisable tools of the sort that you have at Lamekwe, a very long period of several million years of what I would call smashed stone camps, where hominids are just breaking stone to use sharp edges, and they are creating scatters on the surface, but none of those objects looks like a tool.
Well, that's what Lamekwe is.
Yeah.
You know, that Lamekwe is not an older one site.
No,
This
indeed not.
stuff is repetitive percussion.
Yeah.
It is real. I did buy it. You know,
That's right.
I understand. You know, I mean, one thing that's funny about Lamekwe is there's not a heck of a lot of it yet.
No.
You know, but hopefully this summer that will all change. But it actually, that's Lamekwe is that. It's
but there's
it's,
bigger stuff as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but on work, that's
Right.
like
This, yeah, it's
rocks,
just,
you know, like-
it's all, you can tell that it's intentional percussion, and it doesn't look like something that just sort of fell down. and
So
such.
I would argue that that signature that you're seeing at Lamekwe is sort of elaborate enough for us to recognise. Oh, this
Although
is
it was an
human
accident.
measure. Sure. But
It's
it is
pretty,
actually.
I mean, anytime you break a rock, I can see that you've broken a rock, you know,
Sure.
there's no kind of way around it, and that's about, from what's been published so far, that's about what Lamekwe is. So if you're looking for a point of origin,
So
the
go-
problem is if they're throwing things like you're saying there, we would never know that.
No,
You
you
know,
wouldn't.
it's like, you know.
No, you wouldn't know.
And it's like, unless we find a hyena with a rock in its head, you know.
No, that's based on the descriptions of Eskimo children being required to carry pebbles in their pockets if the dogs are loose. Because if a dog attacks a human, the requirement is, I gather, that they have to kill the whole group of dogs. And what the children are obligated to do is to take a rock and throw it at the dogs because it drives the dogs away. That was where that idea came from.
It's a requirement for surveying Peru.
Yeah.
Actually.
And I gather in Turkey
Japan
as
as
well.
well, yeah.
There's some pretty nasty dogs in Turkey. So but to come back to the issue of the Lamekwe, you should be going back to 7 million.
Yeah, while
They're
there's
there.
survey,
They're there.
there's survey going.
7 million years ago, our little ancestors are doing this rock smashing lark. And then that comes back to the point we made earlier, which is the issue with stone tools is that it's not like seasonality, because seasonality is very consistent. What is happening with stone tool patterns on the landscape is they're changing all the time. And it's the selectivity for a brain which is registering. They're changing all the time, the configurations are changing. And I would argue then that the shape elaboration that you get in the Acheulean is the selective effect of differentiation occurring in the landscape. And Peter White did some studies many years ago in New Guinea where he showed that there is a very efficient way of making usable stone tools. And it's really interesting when you make it. You take a big piece of stone, you put another piece of stone on it, you pick another piece of stone, you go bang, bang, and then you sort through the smashed bits, and you'll get a burium, and you'll get a sharp edge, and so on. You do not need to make tool shape at all. And one of the great mysteries of Australian Aboriginal stone tools is that they're edges rather than shapes. So one of the interesting possibilities is that what we're actually seeing with the Acheulean is, and the Gigantolis, is this very strong signalling effect, entirely accidental signalling effect of hominids producing stuff on the landscape. And again, one of the other things we need to do is to start looking, God knows how, at the behaviour of gorillas and see whether gorillas have any reference point behaviour in relation to other places where gorillas have based themselves.
I wonder if you could look at you were talking about the nests earlier, clearly, I mean, those would be identifiable.
Yeah.
be like, I'm not going to put my nest there because there's
That's right.
a nest there.
And then presumably there are some controls for a while, probably for about 2 to 3 months, of urine smell and fecal waste, but they presumably disappear fairly rapidly. I was remarking the other day to a colleague of mine that I always like taking my dog out after a rainstorm because she's not running after looking for urine smell. She's just running around being fit. She's not finding urine smell because it's all been washed away. So if you have a big, powerful dog, wait till it rains and then take them out. So that's the kind of association that I think is beginning to be critical. And I think really where we're going to make a big conceptual breakthrough is actually in the Paleolithic. It's because it is so unfamiliar. The danger with the stuff that most of us work in is, I can make a joke about, oh, the lady's got an iPhone.
Can I go back to your initial question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Not to deliver us from the Paleolithic, I find it
Yeah,
fascinating.
please, yeah.
No, get us out.
I really enjoyed the lecture. I think the multiscalar aspect is important, but my one hang-up was the divide, the dichotomy between materiality and sociality. I'm sure you get that a lot because if you even go back to your interesting example on warfare, where there's the lag between technologies of communications and technologies of weaponry, but there can be a social, ideological explanation for that, arms races.
Sure.
And again, so one could call that embedded in the social and cultural. I do see your point of view, of course, the advocacy of material things often, supersede their original intention. But I would still see that more perhaps as a continuum of the social than say something that was divisible. And I guess it's more a comment than a question. Well, actually, I make this a question because, it makes me just think even of traditional Marxian thinking. Right? He certainly didn't see the social as anything congruent with material, or in fact, historical process was driven by contradiction. Think of the French Revolution, the contradiction there was the inertial lag between those who had the economic power were the emerging burghers, but those with the political power were the aristocracy. That's not working well, and the thing is, the one I think saving grace of materiality is trying to extricate the telos, the teleology. Marxian ideas that, of course, inevitably will be living in a communist utopia someday, which clearly has never happened. But I guess my question is, where does ideology lay here? What power does it have? In a sense that whether it's the ideology of hoover up plastic or maybe to help us be less depressed, perhaps. I don't know.
I think there are two crucial things. Obviously, as I said before, why things are made has a social reason. And one of the things I think is why archaeologists always want to ask the question, why? Why did they build pyramids and so on? What I want to introduce is the argument that the point we do make occasionally when we make it more in the present than in the past is don't ask why did they do it, but ask what was the effect of them doing it, what was the consequence of them doing it. To go back to your point, undoubtedly ideology and social perspective is involved in that weapons disparity, communication disparity, because it was easy to articulate the priority for a weapon that would stop people moving. There wasn't the same obvious demand within that society for the communication systems that would make the difference. I don't disagree with that, nor do I disagree with the proposition that these generals are from a different social class to the soldiers who they're sending out to die. My point was that the generals are in a sense as stuck in a problem as everybody else is. It just happens that they're not dying. It's the other guys who are dying. But one of the really interesting things about this is that then you get these generals capable of fighting mobile war. And after the war, General Haig was the patron of the Society for Assisting Soldiers. He was very dedicated to his soldiers after the war, which doesn't quite square with the social convention. So those are the kind of things that it begins to articulate. If you bring in this notion that there's articulation at one level and disarticulation, non-correspondence at another, it actually makes the inquiry much richer.
And very Marxian.
Yeah, that's the argument. Yeah, fortunately, you get out of determinism in this because there's no driver.
Yeah, but if I could just comment, with your example with the pyramids, my answer, if someone said, why did they build the pyramids? The part of the answer is they built the pyramids,
Yes.
that it's not that the error isn't to say that the social and, that there's the social and the material and they don't correspond. It's that they're kind of imbricated, and not to use the word entangled, so that why did they build the pyramids? A lot of it has to do with the nature of the geology of the Giza Plateau and what was possible, but a lot was ideology, what you would call ideology, but a lot was infrastructure in terms of mobilizing people and food, and so it's this sense of that for me there isn't that kind of dichotomy between social and material. The challenge that I can't say I'm totally successful with is how do you connect these together. That would be more of an inclination. But you're right that I come out of working with small things, and what I liked a lot was the sense of challenge of what happens when you ramp it up to, and that's really interesting.
But also you're working with small things over very long spans of time, and that's where the outcome argument comes in. Essentially what I want to do is to set up a rule which says that nobody in archaeology is allowed to say that the material reflects the social. That's a forbidden word, and they have to work out some other way of saying that, because that isn't the relationship. If you say reflect, what you're saying is that the thing out here is real, and the thing there in the mirror, which is the reflection, is not real. And what that tends to say is that the social out here is real, and the material, which is the stuff you're talking about being a reflection, is not real. But that's cockeyed, because the social is not real, basically, and the material is really real. It's really there. And that would be then the argument for saying that we don't have reflection, we have interassociation, and we have outcome. And the classic example would be big houses are owned by rich people. One argument would then be big houses are owned by rich people who stay within their budget and they persist for a very long time in their house. Very big houses are built by people who've overblown their budget and they don't stay there for very long. That's an outcome analysis. So instead of having what is almost a deterministic rich people build big houses, which you know is not true, we would have instead a question about, is this sociality doing something that is beyond its capacity, or doing something that is leading to risk? And the example with pyramids is the early pyramids are very, very big. And in the Middle Kingdom, they work out that you can build pyramids very economically. They're all sand and mud, and you just put a nice casing outside. They look as good as the Old Kingdom ones, and they don't involve a fraction of the cost. So it's that kind of articulation that it would lead to. And then I'm going to have to think very hard about the Paleolithic. Very hard. So thank you very much.
A lot of what is going, what you're saying with the relationship between materiality and sociality, and a lot of other things we're talking about in this talk sort of seem to mirror a lot of what's going on in activity theory. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a social psychology idea, the theory originating from the 1930s, in Soviet Russia,
Right.
but it's very widely used in the field of childhood education, and it allows people to sort of map activities as goal-oriented systems or goal-oriented tasks and comprising of operations that allow you to sort of overcome the physical barriers that allow you to reach that goal. So people wield tools such as physical tools or language in a way that allows them to obtain or achieve that some sort of predefined goal. And these activities, that systems comprise of tasks that are like smaller components, and then those are comprised of operations that are like if in order to write a page, I have to like physically move my.
So the
in order to write a page, in order to write a book, I have to write a page. So a lot of this seems to, in my point of view, seems to I find that we're thinking about how these activities, what the rationale was, and I feel like a major aspect of activity is that the fact that it's goal oriented, and that we don't understand what the goals are. Why did they build the pyramids? Because there's discursive, but there's also like environmental conditions that have to be overcome. You have to put it on a surface that is that has a certain it can hold a pyramid. You have to like make it out of materials that would lead to a conducive.
So that's the goal notion.
I think. Well, I'm also thinking like that. So I'm also thinking about argumentation and the ways in which you could like leapfrog from how we could infer what these objectives were,
Right.
and shy of like time traveling and asking people, or or observing them to see what they. To sort of disentangle what their discursive aspects of their actions are, we have to rely on indexes in the archaeological record.
One of the interesting points there would be that what I would be raising is that we need to be careful in archaeology about seeing what something does and thinking that was the goal. So, for instance, it is not a goal of the plastics industry to contaminate the ocean. It's not a goal of the motor car industry to cause the horrific casualty level that occurs on the roads. But they do cause those things. We might, in an archaeological analogy, half inclined to say, well, that's the big effect of that thing. So that's what they set out to do. So the point I would add is if we add in outcome analysis, we may actually be able to strip back to what would have been the goals, rather than just taking the outcome as the reason for what they're doing. That might separate that out.
What I'm sort of suggesting, I guess, is that if the goals, the goals of an activity can have we can sort of map out our understanding of what or various understandings of what goals were actually going on, or how activities actually occurred in the systems that actually led to their enactment. But I feel like that itself can also be used to think about these leapfrog, like how things sort of leapfrog and become a grander scale, because we can sort of reverse engineer activity systems that through our kinds of analysis, through like activation, trying to figure out the figure out the the dating of these Paleolithic things, objects that are particularly intriguing. But I'm wondering if we can, if systematizing systematizing a way of thinking about activities and how they accrete or like leapfrog onto broader scale outcomes. I'm wondering how I'm thinking about, and I don't really have an answer. I'm not expecting one, but I'm wondering if you think that this would be productive for thinking about the multiscalar aspects of.
It would be. Are you all familiar with the book by Brian Arthur on technology?
No.
He's the guy who developed complexity bottom-up economics, but he's very interested in technology, and his book on technology is making the point, to be slightly facetious, that you can't make an atomic bomb until you can fire pottery, because all technologies are successive packages of stuff built on what you've already done. Now, the really interesting element of Brian Arthur's assessment, though he didn't pursue it, was that you can have a technical development which ends up having a different purpose to the one it started with. So you've got new intentions coming in all the time. And the example I use quite frequently in presenting this to students is the clock. The clock was actually developed in a religious context in Europe in order to regulate church functions. And it then started to have a use because you could build big clocks of regulating market activity. And when you get into the early modern period, the miniaturization of clocks, which is one of the great achievements of European technology. Clocks used to be this big, and you get them down to a thing that you can carry in your pocket, is being done almost entirely for the service of the middle class. They're using them as prestige objects, and they're using them to systematize their social time. But it is that device which is essential to the Industrial Revolution. You can't run an Industrial Revolution without clocks. But the clock was not developed for that purpose. So it's always the business, and this is why it's quite a complicated business, I think, of short range purpose can be assessed. It may be quite difficult in the Paleolithic because I haven't the faintest idea why they're thinking what they're thinking, but that's your problem. But once you start looking at the accumulation of something through time, then we need a different analytic tool, and that's why I would argue for this outcome tool. The clock wasn't made to make the Industrial Revolution possible, but without it, the Industrial Revolution would not have been possible.
And with that perfect clock, because we got to get you to lunch, Roland, for your, your lunch at 2 o'clock. The reservation was actually at 11:45. But thank you so much.
Pleasure.
That was really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you for coming at such short notice.
Did you like that?
No, it's really great.
So I'll leave that on.
We'll leave it on just because we don't trust that TV. We'll just keep it. I took this.